Most Modern 팟캐스트.
Welcome to the Most Modern Podcast. Today we have a special guest, Elizabeth Hauver. She's an architectural designer and certified passive house consultant, currently serving as the energy design lead at Westwork. A graduate of Wentworth University, Liz has accumulated extensive experience in architecture and energy design, particularly in multifamily housing projects across Massachusetts. Welcome to the
Thanks. I'm really excited to be here with you guys and happy to
Welcome.
share my experiences with Passive House.
Okay, to start with, could you explain what energy design is?
So, energy design is shorthand for designing with energy in mind. I'm self-proclaimed as an energy designer, and this is just a title we use in our company to help define roles and responsibilities. But in a nutshell, energy design is focused on approach to the design process that accounts for energy transmission. So both good and bad. So you're looking at heat transfer, total energy consumption for both site and source energy. And yeah, just a hyper focus on those sustainable components in your design.
So when you said energy designer, you kind of used the term self-proclaimed. I guess what does that mean? What is your role within the overall company? And is this something that's very new that not a lot of firms are doing?
Yeah, so I think the term originated with my predecessor when I was working for Place Taylor. Because Passive House, is still relatively new. I think the first Passive House was built in 2003 in the US, and it only just made it into Energy Code this year. So it's gaining a lot of momentum, but it's taken a while to get there. If you were to look on Glassdoor for the title energy designer, you're not going to find anything. So we kind of had to create this title and this job role to serve this function as these new codes and laws are enacted.
What inspired to go deeper into this field of energy design? Did you know about this field? Were you interested in this when you were studying architecture?
So, not to bring it all the way back to my roots, but I kind of have to.
Yeah, we would love to hear.
I started off becoming interested in sustainable design when I noticed developers entering my neighborhood and developing the land behind my property, and it caused all the wetlands to dry up and a lot of the biodiversity to perish in my community. So from that moment on, I was really interested in how can I approach or contribute to resolving this issue, because I know we still desperately need a lot of housing, but we can't provide housing at the loss of other important things. So I was always interested and drawn towards design, and I felt like architecture was kind of a natural path for me. And then when I entered university, there weren't too many courses available on specific sustainable design, at least at the time I was there. So it was more so a personal passion where I tried to fold it into studio projects and bring in outside resources. And then it just kind of, unfolded its way naturally when I graduated. Found Place Taylor because they were one of the few firms in Massachusetts who were purely doing passive house design. And that was something I was extremely interested in. Something that is low embodied carbon, low operational carbon, that is going to be healthy not only for its occupants, but for the overall environment. So that's what drew me to it.
I just want to jump in real quick. So when you're a student designing the energy, what does that look like? Because if you're designing form, you know what that is, right?
Yeah.
Models and plants and sections and such. But energy is intangible. So what are you looking at?
Spreadsheets. Spreadsheets and energy models. But you are looking at form too. So there's really simple pencil and paper calculations you can run that are called heat loss form factors or surface to volume ratios. You also have your window to wall ratios. So you can look at your overall building shell, the surface area, and compare it to the volume and the square footage. And there's certain thresholds you want to be in for those to kind of tell you quickly how inefficient this building shape is going to perform. So I recently not recently, but a few months ago, went to Passive House Symposium, where I got to watch a presentation about this exact topic. And this woman, she used the term complicated beauty to describe a really beautiful house, but it had a whole lot of bays and undulations. So that kind of property is going to consume more energy than if you were to compare it to a traditional salt box style home, for example.
It's interesting because it's in a lot of places that's not how design is assessed, right? Like we don't think about the cost of running the building when we're presenting it, especially as a student. And yet it's, of course, as you make the claim, it's very important.
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
when you were graduating, looking for opportunities, how did you find this type of jobs?
Right. Yeah, as you said, there weren't very many opportunities when I first graduated. I think a lot of the positions available were actually looking for HERS writers. So,
Hmm.
you can have an architectural background and go into that kind of work where you're on site doing the testing, being the testing agent yourself. But yeah, very few architecture firms offer this.
Right. So what's a HERS rater now? How is it different from energy design?
Yeah, so HERS is Home Energy Rating Index. You'll see it come up a lot if you're doing residential in particular, especially when you're going through the permitting process. That is also an energy model process where you're designing your building to meet these specific ASHRAE requirements. They're based off of ASHRAE 90.1.
Mhm.
And the energy model, you just have to basically achieve a certain percentage energy improvement over baseline, but the baseline energy is based on a 2003 code. So it's already kind of outdated. So that's kind of the flaw with HERS ratings right now is they haven't really caught up to the more stringent requirements of the current stretch code, which is implementing passive house, for example.
So a HERS rater is more of a technician who goes to the site and measures the scores of the building, right? Whereas the energy designer is more involved in the conceptual side too, like throughout the design process. And like Alex have mentioned, probably when you were at school, integrating this energy design model to the architectural design process might have been a very new thing. How did you manage to do that while you were at school?
So I didn't get the opportunity to do it in school just because those softwares weren't made available to us. But when I started my first job at Blaze Taylor, that's where I was introduced to the software called Whoopie Passive.
Hmm.
And so that's the main passive house certification software. It's through a developer called Fraunhofer IDP. It's a German software. It looks at hydrothermal performance in your building, heat transfer, moisture transfer, and it does hourly simulations for an entire year. So it's built very specific to your building. I'm basically recreating your model inside this energy software. So it includes all of your assembly components, all the way down to the type of wood installation material you're using. It includes all your systems too. So your mechanical, your plumbing, your electrical, everything that is going in your building is getting put into this energy model and accounted for. And it's all based on local climate data. So it's very specific and unique to your project.
Mm-hmm. Wow.
And the way I got to use this in design, typically I would get engaged during schematic design, in which I would start the process with running a feasibility study. So I would receive, it's already kind of designed, but a few things can change, like maybe we can remove a bay or slightly increase or decrease the footprint of the building. But ideally, I would be involved in pre-design, where I mentioned earlier, you could perform those napkin calculations of the heat loss form factors. So I think it's kind of teaching designers to implement those simple calculations in their early on design process. So that way, when they do engage certified passive house consultant, I'm entering the scene with a building that is already set up well to successfully achieve certification.
Mhm.
Because I've had projects come my way where I had to tell them, I'm sorry, but you need to shrink your footprint, or you need to remove this, for example. And that's always a tough conversation to have with designers, because we put our heart and soul into the work that we produce. So it's always tough when someone comes and tells you, no, actually, you need to change this.
So is certification though the primary goal? Like when you produce a building, at least in Massachusetts, you need to get certified in order to achieve certain standards, or that's the primary metric that you're going for? In which case, does that mean that that's I guess if you have two options, one that is clearly on the path to certification, one that maybe would be more challenging, that you would go with the one that is easier to certify?
So to kind of answer your first question, any building that's over 12,000 square feet that's a multifamily project has to go for Passive House certification to receive its permit and certificate of occupancy. Other size buildings or other uses can go different routes, but for that particular typology, which is the one I mostly work on, I haven't turned away a project before for that reason. I'm happy to work with designers to give them solutions. And you can still achieve Passive House with a really inefficient form. You're just going to pay for it in other ways. So for example, you're going to have more insulation in your assemblies, or a really expensive window package that's triple glazed and high performing to make up for those. It's kind of like a water balloon is the analogy I like to use. If you squeeze it, it's going to balloon somewhere else. So you have to balance the energy in one way.
Yeah, I want to step back a little bit. So, you are a certified Passive House consultant, and there are many other also different metrics that measure sustainability in building design. Why did you select to go into that path? Is it because it is the most difficult requirement? Therefore, if you meet Passive House in terms of the design scores, then you probably meet everything else. Was that the case?
Yes and no. I kind of naturally fell into Passive House, and that was thanks to my mentor, Travis Anderson. He introduced it to me,
Mm-hmm.
and I personally just really enjoyed it. I think it's really fun to work in these energy modeling softwares and do the calculations for your building. It's a lot more straightforward. If you're trying to make an argument for something, it's based on numbers and data rather than opinions and feelings, which I very much appreciate.
Can you walk
Yeah.
us through, I guess, like how the simulation works? Like, do you receive a design, put it through the simulator, and make recommendations, or are you kind of a part of the design process where a certain maybe scope is under your modification in order to optimize for certain things that you're looking for?
Yeah, so it depends on who is engaging me. So for example, if it's a project that my company is doing, because we're a design firm, an architectural firm that also offers the energy design services. So if I'm working on an in-house project, chances are I'm also the designer on it, which is great because then I have direct influence over what I know is going to work well once I put it into the energy model, just because I've done it so many times. I have an idea of, the ideal window to wall ratio, for example, or the occupant density. But if I'm consulting for an outside architectural firm, sometimes I don't have that direct influence. So there's a lag in information flow, which can be troublesome. But I think it's going well though.
I guess you mentioned a little bit that it depends on when you're engaged.
Mhm.
So where does the role, I guess, of an energy designer play in the overall building process? Like, do you get involved maybe sometimes at the very beginning when people are selecting the site, or do you guys get engaged like at the very end when the building is built and handed over, and maybe you guys are coming in and making measurements and confirming maybe some parameters of the certification?
Yeah. So maybe let me give an overview of my process. I like to pair my work with available incentives. And so the main one that we use is through Mass Save. And their incentive structure is set up so it follows the design process. So you start with schematic design, moving into DD, CD, and CA. So I'll be engaged during SD typically. I'm rarely involved in pre-design, but as I said, that would be ideal if I was. But when I'm engaged during SD, I'm basically given a design. I run it through the simulations. I make recommendations I usually give different case study options. So if you give me a design, I'll give you 3 options back saying, these are the different ways we can approach your process and your design in order to achieve the energy reduction targets that we need to hit for certification. And then they usually pick one pathway forward and we go down that one and we continue to tweak it and modify it as we go through design development and CDs. Now, ideally, at the end of CDs, we'll have been awarded our pre-certification through FIAS. Keep in mind, certification is 2 steps. So you get your design certification at the end of CDs, then you get your final certification at the end of CA. So once the project is complete. Design certification is awarded at the end of CDs. I'll be engaged during CA to go on site, just quality control and check, make sure that what is being built on site matches what I have in my energy model. I'm basically reviewing submittals and change orders and constantly updating that energy model. And then at the end of the project, I'll then submit that again to FIAS for formal review and final certification issuance. And the reason I mentioned Mass Save earlier is because, Passive House does come with a higher cost than if you were to just do a traditional, well, I can't say code minimum building anymore because it is code minimum for a lot of cases. But previously, if you're doing a code minimum building, it is around 3% more affordable than if you were to do a Passive House building. But those numbers they can vary drastically depending on who you talk to. And so Mass Save is a way to help give some of that money back to the client and cover my fees.
What are the main features that distinguishes Passive House compared to standard buildings? Let's say if it's a multifamily house, how are the
So the main principles of Passive House is continuous insulation, airtight envelope. You have an ERV or mechanical ventilation that's also on a recovery feature. So you're recovering some of the energy that you're sending out of your property.
Sorry, ERV is an energy recovery ventilator?
Yes. Yeah. So that's mechanical ventilation. And then you also have high performance heating and cooling. That's mostly heat pumps. Same is true for domestic hot water. So you're looking at heat pump or solar assisted hot water heater systems.
So basically the building needs to be airtight and the ERV becomes more like a lung, like for humans, where it allows the building to breathe. And then you have a heater cooler system that's separate that actually controls the temperature. Is that the way to understand it?
Yes, that's a great way to describe it.
Oh, I see. Then then achieving the airtightness, I guess you can think about type of windows, think about the wall thicknesses. What's the rule of thumb? Like, how is it different from a standard wall in terms of like width or finishings?
Yeah, well, Passive House, you're getting about 7 times more airtight than a traditional home.
Wow.
Previously, homes, many years ago, homes didn't require mechanical ventilation. You kind of relied on air changes in your interior environment and passively through your building assembly in an uncontrolled manner. So that's a little scary when you start to think of it from a building science perspective, because when you're not controlling air movement through your property, it's finding its way in through cracks and it's bringing potential like particulate matter, pollutants, pollen, for example. And most importantly, it's probably carrying moisture with it. And you don't want moisture to just haphazardly enter your assemblies because it can find places to condense on. And once moisture condenses within your assemblies, you're opening yourself up to mold growth or, insect problems, just overall maintenance issues.
Mhm.
So that's one of the big benefits of Passive Houses is you're kind of
I see.
eliminating those.
What we learned from Evan Smith's episode was that before and even until now, builders were encouraged to make the building intentionally breathe. So like intentionally porous. So the air can come in and out freely. Passive House is the direct opposite of that.
What Evan Smith said about how builders used to think about the conventions of building and now these new things that we learned. Maybe Liz, you can talk a little bit about like what are these new things that we learned that really drove kind of the design of Passive House that maybe are some of these concepts you carry into some of your designs?
Just to give one example is vapor sandwiching. So that's when you have 2 vapor barriers in an assembly. Say, for example, you paint your interior wall with latex paint. That's a class 3 vapor barrier. And then in early 2000s construction, they also tended to install this plastic membrane behind your interior drywall. And sometimes they would install a Tyvek system on the outside of your sheathing. You're creating a vapor sandwich where if any moisture is already pre-existing in the cavity or enters that cavity through leaks, say around your window frame, for example, you're trapping that moisture in there. It's not really going to have anywhere to escape through. So it's going to condense, and again, it's going to cause these mold problems. So what builders have learned through that process is no vapor sandwiching, so only one layer for your vapor control. You do still want your assemblies to breathe in terms of moisture transport. You don't want them to breathe in terms of air transport.
I guess like when you design for, say, like a passive house standard, how much of it is fulfilling requirements and how much of it is, in your, I guess, perspective, is just good building practice?
I think passive house is based on good building practice. It's based on building science. So you get a combination of both. The requirements that I see go hand in hand with, developing a healthy home. And that's the big sell about passive house is that you're getting a building that's going to have healthy indoor air quality. It's going to, insulate you from the extreme outdoor temperatures.
But this is this a standard that's very specific to the climate area that you're in? So for instance, I know it's becoming popular in the East Coast, but when talking to Alex, it sounded like it's almost not happening on the West.
Yeah, we don't have, at least in California and Bay Area, we don't have extreme cold. We also here we don't have extreme heat. You do have that in other parts of California. So I think it has a little bit to do too with the building culture and the materials they use, but definitely we're not in a temperate climate. We're in a Mediterranean one. So we're not heating and cooling as actively as one is in Massachusetts, New York, etc.
Right. Well, I certainly have a climate bias for climate zone 5. So if you were to tell me to design a passive house in Florida, I would need to do some more research.
But is it possible? Is it possible to do that in a warm environment? Okay.
Absolutely, yeah. Passive house principles are applicable to anywhere in the U.S. And so that kind of what makes passive house U.S. different from passive house international. Because passive house actually originated in Germany, and then those principles migrated here to the States. And what makes U.S. different is, as I stated before, your energy model's based on your local climate zone. So I actually pull weather data from Logan International Airport when I'm doing projects in and around Boston. So even if I'm working on a project, say out in Western Mass, I'll pull from the nearest weather station over there, anything within 100 miles of that location. So the same would be true if I designed down in Florida. The passive house principles would be slightly different. So the way I would approach passive heating and cooling might be different. I might look at thermal mass in the building, for example, or different means of mechanical ventilation. I probably wouldn't do an ERV, but I'd rather do an HRV because an ERV transfers moisture, whereas an HRV doesn't. So I know it's more humid down there. I wouldn't want to be transferring moisture from outside into the building. Those are just some things to think about if you're designing other climate types.
Can we talk broadly about like what are these things that you're trying to achieve with passive house and like how do they vary across different climate zones? My wife's from Vegas. I imagine building passive house in Vegas is going to be quite different than building in the Northeast, right? Like, so what are these things you're achieving and how might you make different choices based on those climates?
Not being too educated on designs out in Vegas, for example, I would first look at your windows, so your solar heat gain coefficients. I would play around with those to control how much passive heat gain I'm letting into that building. I imagine I'd probably want to reduce it as much as possible because you don't need free heat from the sun in your building, for example. So I would do that as number one. Number two is maybe add shading elements to your windows and doors. I would also look at cool roofs as an option. So definitely have a white roof membrane if you're doing flat roofing. If you're doing, pitched roof single family, I would look at a vented roof cavity system and maybe playing around with where your air barrier is. Instead of running it up through your roof, I would stop it maybe at the ceiling below, totally make the attic unconditioned, potentially even put a fan up there to help transfer air through it. So you're keeping that interior box, which is your conditioned space, more tempered. So those would be some things I would look at to start.
It's incredible your ability to think through the different moments in a house, but in terms of energy, especially airflow, where light is coming in. I know we've all been in that situation where you're in a building that is maybe really nice looking, but it gets way too hot and it doesn't vent the air. It's just not a pleasant place to be, especially as we feel like the weather is getting warmer and warmer these days.
Yeah, totally.
So I guess like as you're walking through that, it sounds like you have this like toolbox of strategies that you kind of apply depending on different scenarios that you're a part of. Like you mentioned a few things like, materials, membranes, maybe like air moving systems. Like how much does new technology play in your role? Like are you constantly keeping up with new things that you can add to your toolbox, or are there kind of some established practices that will withstand the test of time?
Yeah, so it's tough to be completely abreast with changing technologies, but I like to go with the rule of BASI, so best available scientific information. Anything that's 10 years or younger is what I'm looking at when I'm researching this new technology, for example. I do rely a lot heavily on my MEP engineers, but also my Passive House community. So Passive House Massachusetts is a group of like-minded individuals who are really interested in pursuing these hyper-sustainable projects. So there's a lot of resources that I could tap into and say, hey, what's the latest? Or have you tried this Minotaur ERV system? Like I've heard great things about it, but I've never seen it installed. So there are a lot of like magic box items coming over from Europe that are slowly trickling their way in. But, for example, I've been dying to implement a Sanco domestic hot water system. It's a completely separate domestic hot water system where you have your storage tank and then a separate heat pump condensing unit outside. We typically see hybrid heat pumps where the condensing unit is built into the heat pump unit, into the hot water tank itself, and is located inside your unit. But the great thing about the Sanco unit is that heat pump's separate outside your building. So you're not pumping that cold air into your unit, for example, when the condenser is working to condense that air, heat the water, release that cool air into your space. But alas, I have not had a client say, yes, we can go ahead and do it, because you just don't see it very often. So new technologies take a while to catch on, even though they work out great in the energy model. I'll model something that works out extremely well, like you're going to almost hit net zero. But then, the engineer, for example, maybe hasn't used that system before. So it puts more burden on me to research it and try and pitch it to them, where it takes me a little bit out of my comfort zone because I'm not a plumbing engineer or a mechanical engineer. So it's a little bit out of my lane to recommend those things. So it's also getting your MEP engineers on board with it and kind of educating them on this as well.
Speaking about comfort zone, I'm interested in understanding the scale. I know that there are examples for single family homes, multifamily homes for like 30, maybe 30 units, or even maybe 50 units. Can there be more? Can it be applied to a high rise, for instance?
Yeah, the term passive house is definitely misleading. It's not just for houses, it's for any kind of building. You could use it for commercial too.
An office can be passive house, a museum can be passive house, right?
Absolutely. I think you see a lot more passive house certified schools. Schools and libraries tend to be more popular for passive house. I personally haven't had the pleasure of working on one yet. I'm mostly in the residential world, but I've done everything between, single family to large scale multifamily, both retrofit and new construction.
What changes in scale? Is it only the capacity of the systems, or what are the major differentiators?
So the way passive house certification works is I enter in the building square footage, the occupancy amount, and the location. And I give that information to FIAS, and FIAS tells me, hey, based on your building scale and typology, you need to hit these energy reduction targets. So it's different for every building.
I see. There is this notion in the industry that building more sustainably, doing passive house, it costs more. Is that really true?
So I think I said this earlier. Passive house is roughly 3% cost premium, but that really depends on who your builder is and who your team is.
I see. So having an experienced team and a builder is a must.
Absolutely.
But 3% is manageable. But what do I get if I pay 3% more?
Well, you get a house that's going to save you a lot in operational costs.
Oh.
Yes, I've seen my passive house projects. I can reduce the energy consumption and your utility bills by 50% just by going with passive house. So that's where you see your return on investment. Albeit it
So,
takes longer to get there, but
right. But it is highly beneficial for a long-term owner. And you mentioned at the beginning briefly that now it's a requirement for Boston. When did that happen?
January 1st of this year.
Oh my. Is that for all new construction buildings now? Like you said, larger than 12,000 square feet?
Yeah, and it has to be multifamily typology.
I see.
So
I'm
if
glad
you,
that I'm doing it. I'm doing it already for all my projects.
yeah,
Future proof.
right. So if your building had not been permitted before that date, say you were at 100, say you're at 95% CDs, but you
Mhm.
didn't submit for permit yet, and that date happened, well, now you have to go back and kind of rework your design to hit Passive House if you want to get your permit. So I've encountered a few projects that are in that bucket, and I feel terrible for them.
Well,
Because
now it's a requirement. People got to do it.
Yeah.
throughout, I feel like this whole conversation, you talked about simulation and then kind of adjustment after it's built. Like, how close are you able to simulate to what you're expecting in the field? And when these numbers don't match up the way you expect, what happens?
That's a great question. So any kind of predictive energy modeling that you do is going to have errors because my energy modeling bakes in certain assumptions. So for example, utilization rates of occupants. I'm assuming that an occupant uses hot water 3 times a day, just as an example. And in reality, this person could use hot water 7 times a day. So already that's a big change between what I was modeling versus the outcome. Generally, there's a 15% error of margin between what I'm modeling and the energy model versus how it actually performs. And that is ultimately due to how the occupant uses the space. So at the end of a project, this is only something I've recently started doing where I've put together like a little brochure that building owners can give their tenants that basically say, welcome to your Passive House unit. Here are some key features about it. Here are some things you should be made aware of and, good use practice. So for example, don't open your windows when you have your heat pumps on. A very basic thing
Yeah.
that anyone who's gone through architectural design knows, but someone who's used to not having heat pumps in their unit might just think to open the window.
A 50% is actually super amazing. Like, I feel like if developers can get promised 15% error margin on construction costs, they would be really, really happy. So I guess,
Yeah.
do you see this as like a gap that's closing or something that as new building technology advances, like simulation software will kind of have to play catch up and will always stay within that zone?
I'm not sure, actually. That is a really good question. You would have to predict occupant behavior. So maybe that would be more successful in an existing building that you're retrofitting, where the occupants are to remain the same, because then you can look at the historical energy use of the property. So like how much electricity are they consuming, how much gas and how much water are these occupants consuming? And then you can kind of build up a utilization profile for these tenants and apply that profile in your energy model and use that as your base assumptions to then design around. So you can base your envelope and your MEP choices around that particular utilization group. That's
I
not
think that's
something I've seen yet, though.
that's sort of the nature of design, right? Like you can never know exactly how something's going to be used. It's not a solution, the solution. It is a solution, and I think that's what's quite interesting about this. I haven't even talked about that before with anybody about Passive House, which is the actual person who's using it. We sort of imagine like the Passive House is this autonomous being that is just much more sustainable than its neighbor. But at the end of the day, houses are basically as good as, or they're a tool for someone to live in. And your description of creating this brochure is almost like getting a new car. It's like you don't understand all the bells and whistles, and you might you might drive it the wrong way. I think that's incredibly interesting, and it also brings into the idea that one of the major actors in design of buildings is also the people using the buildings themselves. So it's not necessarily the architects or the builders; it's actually the occupants. And so I'm curious too, like how much of your work involves not just telling people how to use a building, but also educating broader public as to why maybe their neighbor is building a passive house building or why this new apartment building showed up on the corner of the street. if that's something that um, you're invested in.
Yeah, I've given a few presentations through Passive House Accelerator, and um, I'm blanking on the names. There's one for Mass Timber that I gave a while back. I do like to try and present on this topic, though, and particularly to my current client base. For example, I'm working with this nonprofit where they have a larger portfolio. I'm only working with them on one particular building. But they approached me saying, hey, it'd be great if you presented Passive House to our overall company so that way all of our project managers who are working on different projects can be aware of these things. And I think it's through education where you can see improved energy performance. Because like you said, if you're given a new car without instruction manual, you might not know how to use it right.
Yeah, I'm glad that you mentioned it, Liz. That's another large part of this growth is related to the existing building stock. In terms of the retrofit, is it any different from new construction? Anything interesting that you found there?
Retrofit and Passive House is still an extremely gray area for me, especially around the energy code. So this is a process that I'm going through right now with a few projects that are deep energy retrofits. We're working with a few different affordable housing authorities in Boston where we did these feasibility studies. And, if you have a level 3 alteration where you're modifying more than 50% of your building, in theory, you have to bring the whole building up to energy code. But energy code is Passive House.
Right.
It becomes very costly, and to bring that many buildings up to Passive House level for an affordable housing developer.
Mm-hmm. So even with the incentives, it seems like there needs to be a little more to encourage more developers to even think about or act on it.
Yeah, I think we're seeing more funding. We definitely need more because there's so many existing housing stock that needs to be retrofitted. But the Inflation Reduction Act kind of resulted in a trickling of a lot of money that's coming to Massachusetts, to all the states really. But it's up to local initiative groups to come together and distribute this funding in a meaningful way. So I reach out to them and get the general pulse on available grants and funding. So groups that I like to talk to are Rocky Mountain Institute, LIST, Mass CEC, and MADOER. Those are a lot of the big groups that are kind of releasing and running these grant programs. So for example, a recent grant that I helped a client apply for is through MADOER. So that was the Deep Energy Retrofit Program. And for this particular project, they got awarded $13 million. So there is substantial funding available out there. It's just a matter of knowing where to look and who to ask.
Right. What are the other common challenges that you face in your daily work?
I think probably fee structuring, if I'm being honest. At least personally, that's what I'm struggling with a lot.
Why? Does the developers don't understand your fee, or what's the case? What's the problem there?
That's part of it. So it's educating developers on what Passive House is, why you need it, and why my fee is the amount that it is. Because I think a lot of developers are used to LEED certification. That's been around a lot longer than Passive House. So I can't speak too much on LEED because I'm not LEED certified and I don't do those certifications, but I have to imagine the fees associated with LEED might be a little more affordable than if you were to do Passive House. And so I find that developers are comparing my fees to those ones when the amount of work and the type of work you're doing is very different.
Right. With my limited knowledge, it seems like Passive House involves much more on the data science side and the statistical performance of the actual building itself, looking at the combination of different materials and fixtures, windows, so on and so forth. Whereas LEED is more of a holistic type of evaluation of sustainability as a lifestyle too. That includes a lifestyle aspect in there too, right?
Right.
I guess let's like, is Passive House required for all of Massachusetts? Like, since January this year, like, have you seen the tone change after it became a requirement rather than something optional?
Probably just Boston.
I assume LEED can't be a substitute for passive house, right?
That's correct. LEED isn't a substitute. They're very different certifications. So the energy code that requires passive house is, the longer name for it is the Specialized Opt-in Stretch Energy Code. So the key there is the opt-in term.
Mm-hmm.
Different towns in Massachusetts can choose to adopt this specialized energy code. And so to walk back a little bit, there's 3 levels to energy code in Massachusetts. You have your base energy code, which is IECC 2021. And then you
Mm-hmm.
have your stretch energy code, which builds upon the base code. And then on top of that, you have the specialized code. And it's the specialized one that requires passive house for multifamily projects over that size threshold.
Yeah, and of course, being Massachusetts leading the green design realm, of course, we had to elect the highest possible standards.
Yeah, I mean, it's the best way to hit our 2030 goals in all reality. To stay on track for meeting the Paris Agreement with the 2030 challenge, you have to design to passive house. That's the only way you're going to reduce your operational carbon enough to really achieve that.
What motivates you to do this work, and if you can advise people if they are interested in going the path that you are in now?
Yeah, so to answer your first question, what motivates me, I'm going to go back to that story I gave about the the wetlands kind of drying up behind my property. My second passion, if I didn't go into architecture, would have been in landscape restoration.
Mm-hmm.
And I think designing a built environment, not only sustainable for people, but sustainable for the overall planet, or other species, is incredibly important. Passive house is only one small means of getting there. Reducing your operational carbon will help keep the climate from heating up more, but we need to be looking at other things. And I'm not talking about just bird-safe glass. Different
Right.
ways to really revive the ecosystem in and around buildings and make maybe overlaying migratory patterns
Mm-hmm.
and zoning overlays for different bird species. I'm just throwing it out there.
Hmm.
And for people who are interested in fields, I guess I would give a little bit of shout out to Wentworth, because they did improve their program after I graduated. So they do offer a CPHC course. We recently hired a grad who went through it, and he graduated with his CPHC license, which was really nice. But I think for me, I found success in this pathway because I sought out small firms where you can wear many hats and you can dabble in a lot of things. And that really accelerates your career growth. If you're thrown into new situations and always challenging yourself and just, seeking out new information, that's the best way.
No, it's a fascinating conversation, Liz. I think, first of all, it completely changed my sort of perspective on what passive house is. Passive house seems so simple, but at the same time, there's multiple dimensions to it, from the usability to the construction to the certification, all of this kind of world of different challenges that you have to face. And I think it's, I also really appreciate your perspective on your career and finding places where you can learn things progressively and pick up new and little challenges along the way. So I'm curious, maybe relative to where you see energy design going and where you see yourself going, where do you think those two overlap? Is this something that you're going to continue to pursue? What are the things on the horizon that you're looking out for?
Yeah, I absolutely see myself continuing to do this work. I've developed an interest in overlapping sustainable work with available funding sources for clients, because I'm finding that to be a hurdle for achieving passive house, is the financial side of it. So right now I'm heavily involved in finding grants and funding for clients to further that endeavor. And I foresee, kind of growing the energy design department within our company so that we can take on more passive house work. Because with these new code changes, there are going to be a lot more projects that have to go through this process.
Yeah, I'm sure you're really busy these days, so got to find some people to help you out, I guess.
Absolutely. But it's good. I was very excited about the code update. I think it's the best way to go forward. It's also great job security, if I'm being frank.
Nice. So with that
Yeah.
positive note, I'll bring it home. So thank you so much, Liz, for joining us today at another episode of Most Modern. If you haven't already, for the listeners, please subscribe and listen to Most Modern. It's available on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Music.
Most modern.
Most modern.
Most modern.
Most modern. 모스트 포던 팟캐스트.